Welcome to the Wiener Conference Call series. These one-hour, on-the-record phone calls feature leading experts from Harvard Kennedy School who answer your questions on public policy and current events. Wiener Conference Calls recognize Malcolm Wiener's role in proposing and supporting this series, as well as the Wiener Center for Social Policy at Harvard Kennedy School.
Good day, everyone. I am Mari Mejias in the Office of Alumni Relations and Resource Development at Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to this on-the-record Wiener Conference Call, which is kindly sustained by Dr. Malcolm Wiener, who supports the school in this and many other ways. Today, we are joined by Desmond Ang, who is Assistant Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Ang is an applied economist with a particular interest in the intersection of race, government, and media. His research examines the social impacts of police violence, the effects of voter protections on turnout and polarization, and the role of media on racial prejudice. We are so fortunate that he's agreed to share his thoughts today with the Kennedy School's alumni and friends. Professor Ang.
Thank you so much, Mari. Thank you so much to everyone for coming and taking part in this. As Mari mentioned, today I'll be talking about some of my research, and specifically I'll be focusing on my research thinking about the social impacts of police violence. So as a bit of motivation to the topic, which may not be necessary given the state of the world, obviously after the police murder of George Floyd last year, there's been a lot of discussion, public discourse, political discussions around police officer use of force, police violence. You know, how do these events keep occurring? What can we do to sort of mitigate some of these events? And I think it's important to emphasize the extent to which this current moment that we're seeing, the police killing of George Floyd, the police killing of many sort of individuals each year in this country, including a number of unarmed minority individuals, is the product of countless historical and explicit policy decisions that we've made about what policing should look like in this country. So that includes decisions about where we should be policing, who we should be policing, as well as how we should be doing those things, right? And so these decisions and what we're seeing today aren't made, you know, the circumstances we see today didn't occur in a vacuum. They occurred as a result of how we think about policing in this country. And that in itself is going to be informed by research and empirical research and academic research as well. And, you know, as a researcher here at the Kennedy School, as an economist here, that's sort of the explicit role of what we're trying to do. The end goal of why we do this research is to help inform policymakers to make sort of better economic decisions, social decisions, political decisions. And so for today's talk, I want to do two things. Hopefully we'll have time to do this. The first is obviously to go over some of my own research. More generally, what do we know about the effects of police on local communities from the literature as a whole? But I also want to spend some time taking a step back and thinking about how what we know about police, the questions that we asked about police, and how that in turn is going to inform policy decisions is very much going to intersect with representation and diversity in the academic institution. So I think both of these things hopefully will come out from this talk. So if we look at sort of the research landscape historically, we can see what questions have empirical researchers asked about the effects of police. And so as sort of a toy example, we can just go to Google Scholar and say, okay, what do we know about the effects of police? Here, I'm just looking at articles that were published before 2005. And these are the articles that come up. These are the sort of the first 5 articles that come up when we think about what does academic literature say about what police do, what impact they have on communities. And you'll see the first article is titled Using Electoral Cycles and Police Hiring to Estimate the Effects of Police on Crime. This is by an economist, Stephen Levitt at UChicago. And essentially, this article looks at the effects of police on crime deterrence. Second article is actually very similar in theme, the general deterrent effects of police patrol in crime hotspots. Again, thinking about the effects of police on crime. Third article is again the same. The fourth article is a little bit different, asking, you know, what are the determinants of how stressed officers are, how much work they're doing, their relationships. And the fifth article, again, comes back to this very common theme, which is thinking about police and how they impact crime. And so obviously, this is a very important question. Perhaps the very first order question about what do police do is thinking about how they impact crime. And so you'll see, we've seen, you know, just looking here, 2 things emerge. So first is obviously there's this very well-defined and somewhat narrow research question that researchers have asked historically about what do police do? And we're asking that really in the realm of thinking about how police affect crime. The other thing that emerges that is perhaps less obvious from just looking at this page is that there's actually a very narrow author set. The types of people who are asking these questions, these articles are all written by white men, right? And so you can see that historically, there's a very narrow set of questions that we asked about police. There's a very narrow set of people asking those questions. And that's, again, not to say anything about the quality of that research. That research in general is very well done. If we look through the research, we find one generally true consensus, which is that on average, as we increase more cops, areas that increase more cops have less crime. And so this is a causal claim that we can say with some confidence, and again, is relatively agreed upon in the research. And that has led to, and that has had implications for policy. And so here is one example. This is an article by Maddie Iglesias in Vox, saying the case for hiring more police officers. This is a crime fighting idea that actually works. Again, the research shows that more cops equals less crime, and it's something that's relatively popular across all racial groups. Okay? And obviously this is a pre-George Floyd article, but even in recent times, we've seen sort of this discussion of returning to this idea that, you know, we maybe should have more officers because that's going to reduce crime. And again, I'm not saying anything, you know, that conclusion is relatively well-founded in the empirical literature that we have. And we can see this, you know, these research findings translated and reflected in actual policy. So if you look over the past 50 years in the United States, and we look at a number of police officers that we employ in this country, as well as the number of police officers per capita in this country, you'll see there's a huge increase in that over time. This is true both in big cities and in all cities. And that we've also seen a growth coincident with this growth in number of police officers in the types and intensity of policing that we do, this growth in this sort of proactive or broken windows policy policing in this country. So here you can see in New York City during the 2000s, there's this large increase in stop and frisk in New York City, this explosion in the number of sort of street stops that were occurring, in which police would just stop people on the street to check if they had guns or not, before the court mandated end of stop and frisk due to racial discrimination. We can clearly see there's this large increase in stop and frisk rates, large increase that's specifically targeted towards Black and Hispanic communities. And we can also see this research translating then into outcomes, into large growth in our incarcerated population. So here we're just looking at the incarceration rate in the United States over time, going back to 1880. You'll see over the past 50 or 60 years, there's an increase in the incarceration rate of something like 5 times, like a 5x increase in the incarceration rate. The US today has more people incarcerated than any other country in the world. It also has a higher rate of people incarcerated than any other country in the world. This is not just with regards to other Western democracies. You can think of any country, the US is going to beat them in terms of having people incarcerated. And again, this is something that has led to large increases in racial disparities. So here we're just looking at incarceration rates by race. You'll see large differences in likelihood of being incarcerated. Specifically, Black individuals are just far, far more likely to be incarcerated than white or Asian individuals. Also higher rates for Latinx, Native American, and Hawaiian individuals. Yeah. And all of this also is going to inform what we're seeing with regards to police violence. And so if we look over the data, if we look over this across a number of different data sets, there's not one sort of like standard for thinking about, for measuring how much police violence occurs in this country. But if we look across all of these things, you'll see there's been a large increase over time in the number of people each year who are killed by police. Nowadays, it's something like 1,000 individuals each year are killed by police in this country. And generally, that's generally stable in the recent past. It's also generally stable that most of these events are going to involve racial minorities. A large share of them, something like 40% of these events, involve the police killing of somebody who didn't have a gun. And again, it's very important to emphasize the extent to which this is an explicit outgrowth of policy decisions that have been made, and that officer use of force in the case of George Floyd and in many other cases is a product of decisions around how much discretion we afford officers. And across the United States, less than 0.5% of officer-involved killings result in an officer conviction. And all of which is to emphasize that use of force is very much sort of a feature. What we're seeing with George Floyd, what we're seeing with other police killings of unarmed minorities, and more generally, use of force is very much a feature of how we do policing in this country, not so much a bug. Okay? And again, you can imagine that it's very much an outgrowth of this research where we're saying if the primary goal of police is to reduce crime, well, then we should have more policing, we should have more intensive policing, etc. At the same time, I think, and I'm sure all of you will have different definitions on what the purpose of policing is, but I think most of us would think that it's a far broader goal than just reducing crime. So here's one definition provided by the Charles Koch Institute, showing that saying that the purpose of law enforcement is to promote public safety and uphold the rule of law so that individual liberty may flourish. And so crime reduction is not so much the end, but the means to the end, to promoting safety, to ensuring community and individual well-being. And so in this lens, crime is just one input for public safety and community well-being, obviously an important one, but it's not the only one. And we can sit here and think of a number of other ones that we might imagine could be very important. Some of these things might be things like procedural justice, your sense of justice, your sense of fairness in the criminal justice system. Others are trust in government, perceptions of safety, social cohesion, economic well-being, psychological well-being, et cetera, et cetera. These are all things that we think policing might impact and that we think police may have a role to play in sort of improving these outcomes as a way of benefiting public safety and community well-being. These are all different aspects of those larger concepts. And so thinking about policing only with respect to crime is a relatively narrow frame for thinking about the impact, again, that police have on communities, much less for determining how much policing we should have, what types of policing we should have, et cetera. And this isn't something that we just are sitting around theorizing in the wake of George Floyd. There's been a long history of public discussions about police, about use of force, and about how police actions can impact a number of things that aren't just crime, a number of very important margins, societal margins that aren't just crime. So you can go back to the Kerner Commission reports in the 1960s, in which the federal government was concerned about large amounts of social unrest in this country. And so they investigated that, and one of the conclusions they came to was that some of the social unrest was driven by a widespread belief among African Americans in the existence of police brutality and a double standard of justice protection. So again, this idea that policing might have some implications for how we view discrimination, how we view justice, how we view the criminal justice system more generally. We can go back even further to the New York Times. This is from 1850s. There's an editorial about a police killing of a known criminal named Hollis. And in this editorial, you'll see that the New York Times editorial board says, this guy Hollis was no good in some sense. He was a notorious pestilent ruffian. He clearly deserved to die. But then they go on to say, nothing can more forcibly illustrate the degradation into which local government has fallen. It's bad enough to have a gang of lawless and uncontrollable scoundrels among us, but it's much worse to have their lawlessness imitated by the men whose special duty it is to enforce the law. So again, this idea that it's a very long-running idea that police might have some impact on how we trust the government. The policing and law enforcement are obviously one of the most visible forms of government, and our interactions with them, what they do, can inform how we actually view the government, how we view other institutions as well. In more recent periods, you can see that all the largest urban protests that have occurred in the United States over the past 75 years were all sparked by acts of police violence. So we saw this last year with George Floyd. We saw it in 2014 with the Ferguson riots. We can think of the Rodney King riots in the early 90s, and the Watts riots in the 1960s. All of these incidences of large social unrest driven by actions that police conduct. That being said, the social impacts of these events, thinking about how police affect these other margins of community well-being, just were never really rigorously examined in the academic literature until very recently. So it's only recently that researchers have started to really interrogate these broader questions about what do police do? What impact do police have on communities? And so we can run the same Google Scholar search, thinking about effects of police, limiting to studies that came out in more recent years, last year or this year. What we find is a very different set of papers. So one, this bottom paper, the overlooked perspective of police trust in the public, thinking about how community trust, again, something that we think is very salient to how policing, to the police efficacy, but then also an outcome that police can impact might depend on police actions. This other paper, effects of body-worn cameras, looks at the effects of body-worn cameras on police actions and civilian complaints. So how do body-worn cameras, what are the different things that policing can do, and how does it affect whether or not civilians trust police, whether or not they have grievances or concerns about police? Again, very different from thinking about crime. This paper, effects of police on mental health of Black families, again, something very different than thinking about police, effects of police on crime. Again, here thinking about effects of body-worn cameras on civilian complaints. And then this first article by this guy that sounds like a really interesting guy, the effects of police violence on inner city students, really thinking again about this very holistic idea of what do police do, what are the different margins they can impact in the community in terms of community well-being. And so here, two things will emerge. Obviously, one is that we have this very diverse set of research questions that's, again, very different, a much broader take on the role of policing, but again, not something that's not informed or completely thought up in academia, but something that's very well rooted in sort of historical narratives, in sort of current events as well, in terms of thinking about what do police do and actually taking that seriously and measuring those impacts on things other than crime. Another thing that'll emerge, and you can just see this from sort of the list of names in these articles, as well as me presenting this to you, is that not all of these authors are white and they're not all men. There's a much broader, diverse author set here asking a much broader set of research questions about the role of police. And so we do think that this is going to be really important for when we actually have these conversations, exactly the conversation that we're having today about what's the optimal level of policing. It's not just, when we think about that, it's not just calibrating, how police affects crime. It's thinking about the sum of how police affect communities across these different dimensions and weighing them against each other to then come up with the optimal policing solution. And so this is very much where my work lies, is thinking about what are the social impacts of police violence on different aspects of community well-being. Specifically in my work, I look at how police killings affect the emotional and academic well-being of children, how civilians and citizens engage with government, their trust in government, as well as how they engage with law enforcement, whether or not they're willing to report crimes and their willingness to commit violence. And so to do this, and I'll go over this very shortly, I'm excited to show you my results. We'll just be leveraging really, really detailed, granular data on where students, where voters, where 911 calls live or emerge from, merging that with very detailed data on the time and location of where police killings occur. And so again, getting to what we actually find. So in that first paper, we saw the effects of police killings on police violence on inner city students. What I do there is I'm going to combine very detailed data for 15 years from Los Angeles, where there were over 600 police killings during this 15-year period. Again, we have the exact time and location of these events, which then I can merge and map onto where all the public high school students in Los Angeles lived, as well as each student's various academic outcomes. And so just to show you what we're actually doing here, what we're showing you is just absenteeism rates for students based on how far they live from where a police killing was going to occur in the week before the police killing occurred. And so you can see police killings occur in neighborhoods where absenteeism rates are relatively similar to neighborhoods that are further away from where the police killing occur. But now we can look at these same trends in terms of absenteeism rates in the week after a police killing occurred, which is this line. And what you see here is that for students that live very close to where the police killing occurred, there's this large increase in their likelihood of missing school the following week, okay? So we can do the same thing. We can look at students who live close to where a police killing occurred, before and after the police killing occurred, compare their outcomes to students who live slightly further away, who are in all other dimensions very similar, and see how that affects their outcomes over a longer period of time. So here we can look at their effects on GPA. How do police killings, how does exposure to a single police killing affect students' GPA? And here we're defining, again, exposure as living close within half a mile of a police killing. You'll see that students who are exposed to this police killing experience significant decreases in their GPA, lasting several semesters. And these aren't small effects. So these GPA effects are, if we benchmark them, they're as negative as some very high intensity tutoring programs are positive. But on average, each police killing in Los Angeles, where things are relatively dense, is going to impact 300 students. So these these effects you're seeing here is the average effect across 300 students who happen to live within close to each police killing. And again, there's over 600 police killings in Los Angeles during this time period. These students also experience large decreases in their mental well-being and psychological well-being. So here what we're showing you is that students who are exposed to police violence are significantly more likely to be diagnosed as emotionally disturbed, which is a special education designation that's highly correlated with PTSD. And these effects are going to serve to exacerbate persistent racial disparities in education. So it's not only that Black and Hispanic students are more likely to live in neighborhoods where police killings occur, but conditional on living close to a police killing, Black and Hispanic students are much more negatively impacted than white or Asian students. That's what we're seeing in the left graph here. White and Asian students actually are not affected on average by police killings. Black and Hispanic students experience significant negative effects on their GPA. And this is coming, as you can see in the right panel, predominantly from police killings of other minority individuals. So police killings of Black and Hispanic individuals lead to these specifically dire effects for the educational well-being of Black and Hispanic students nearby. And the long-run costs of this are enormous. So here what we're looking at is exposure to police killings. What's the average effect for exposure to police killing during high school on students' end GPA when they left high school, their cumulative GPA when they left high school, their likelihood of graduating from high school, and their likelihood of actually enrolling in college. And so black dots correspond to effects for Black and Hispanic students, white triangles correspond to effects on white or Asian students. You'll see, again, there's these large impacts on students' academic achievement. That's going to cause them to be much less likely to graduate from high school and ultimately less likely to actually enroll in college. And so if we were to back this out, what does this mean? Over this 15-year time period that I'm looking in Los Angeles, police killings caused 2,000 students of color to drop out of high school. And this is, again, just in LA. And so we can clearly see there's this large educational and economic cost of police violence. And we definitely want to be thinking about this. If we think about what's optimal law enforcement strategy, we want to be benchmarking this to whatever gains we get in crime reduction, right? And so these are margins on which it's really important to measure these things so that we can then come up with an optimal law enforcement strategy, as opposed to just narrowly focusing on one specific outcome like crime. We can also look at other outcomes. So here we're looking at how police killings, how living in the same block as a police killing affects civic engagement in terms of how likely someone is to register to vote, how likely someone is to actually vote. What we find is that police killings actually increase voter registration and turnout among citizens nearby. And this is driven entirely by Black and Hispanic citizens. And it's not so much that these individuals are just responding to violence. What we find is that the largest effects, the largest gains in turnouts and registrations are coming from police killings in which the person who they killed was unarmed versus the person who they killed was armed. That's what we see on the left is unarmed killings, on the right is unarmed killings, on the left is armed killings. And we further see, if we look at referendum voting, that individuals who are exposed to police killings are then much more likely to vote for criminal justice reforms that seek to soften and loosen the criminal justice system and penalties. And so all of this, again, points to this idea that these police killings can have some impact on how individuals feel about the criminal justice system, whether they think that it's just, whether they think that there's discrimination, etc. We can see this borne out in actual voting activities. Even from a criminological perspective, there's evidence that police violence might have the perverse and the adverse effect that we want it to. As opposed to reducing crime, it could actually increase crime. So here we're looking at just raw data from a number of different cities, how this gun violence and 911 calls change in the wake of George Floyd's murder. That's what this red line, this red vertical line on these graphs indicate. In the left graph, what you can see is that right after George Floyd's murder, there's a huge spike in actual gun violence casualties and injuries in this country. There's actually a large decrease in 911 calls, right? And so what you're finding is that George Floyd is murdered by police. That's actually going to increase societal violence, and it's going to decrease the likelihood of civilians actually calling police, reporting crimes to police, etc., which we might think is a really important input into how effective policing actually is, and ultimately how safe cities are. Okay, so all of these things that we're looking at here are things that were outside the purview, outside the scope of the questions that people had asked historically about what's the role of police, how the police affect communities. But I would argue these are things that are really fundamental to know if we're going to actually sort of do some cost benefit analysis to think about what's the optimal amount of policing we should have. And so again, there's significant research, and this, if you look at this research that exists, it's very well done. It's very valid that more police does equal less crime. But then the question becomes, at what and whose cost? Are these crime benefits that we get from having more police, more intensive policing, are those outweighed or not by other consequences of having more police and different forms of policing? And there's increasing evidence that police violence can cause significant social harm across a number of different dimensions, especially for racial minorities. So I think there's two sort of like main takeaways from this talk that I think are important to emphasize. From a policy perspective, obviously, I think this highlights potential role of alternative methods of fostering public safety. This could mean a number of different things. Obviously, it could just mean more police officers doing different things. It could mean less police officers. It could mean, again, different ways of approaching policing. It can also mean different stakeholders getting involved in communities, thinking about community investment in terms of early education, in terms of social safety net benefits, things that we know in the long run have some mitigating effect on crime. But I think there's also a really important takeaway from a research perspective, from sort of like a meta thinking about academia perspective and the research institution, is just emphasizing the importance of diversity in academia. So I think it's often easy to think of diversity as this zero-sum game, right? So if we're thinking of affirmative action in schooling, affirmative action in hiring, we're thinking in these very narrow terms about who's getting this job and who is, whether or not this person is better than the other person at completing a given task that's been assigned to them. But especially in something like academia, especially something like research, there's a lot of portfolio value potentially of having diversity, of making sure that we're asking all the questions that we need to get to the right policy decisions. And I think this is obviously just one case in which you can clearly see there's this large difference in terms of the questions that have been asked historically and presently, as well as that's reflected in sort of diversity of authors asking questions. So that's it for my prepared slides. I'm obviously happy to answer questions and hear your comments as well. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much. So we're now going to open the session for your questions. To ask a question, please use the virtual hand raising feature of Zoom. And please, in true Kennedy School fashion, keep your question brief and end it with a question mark. You'll be notified via Zoom's chat feature when it's your turn to speak. You may experience a short lag time, so make sure to unmute yourself when you hear from the staff. And if you could also just let us know your Kennedy School affiliation, that would be great. So I'm going to start things off with a first question that was submitted earlier by Yvonne Malloy, MPP 1996. And that question is, what is the role of instant access to social media and videos of these acts of violence? Have they helped or hindered the process of justice?
Yeah, that's a great question, Yvonne, and it's a complicated one. In my own work, I find that, and especially if you think about these effects of police violence and them being very sort of geographically concentrated, a lot of these effects come from knowing that these events occurred, right? And so there's a little bit of this idea of like ignorance is bliss. Like if we didn't publicize these events, a lot of people wouldn't have been exposed to this very traumatic video of George Floyd being killed. Maybe that would have actually been better in some sense in terms of like a short run mental health, emotional health type standpoint. On the other hand, I think that especially in this country, there's so much segregation in terms of where people live across racial groups, as well as very large differences across those neighborhoods in terms of how policing is done, that these videos really provide a window, especially for individuals who don't live in the types of communities where police violence is common, to understand and empathize with what police violence and policing looks like in different neighborhoods. And that's a really hard concept to sort of like grasp just looking at numbers. I think looking at some of these social media videos give this other sort of more extreme take on sort of really getting a sense of what these things look like. And if we look at survey data in terms of how people trust police before and after George Floyd, what you find is that across all different communities and across all different cities in this country, even white individuals, Asian individuals, those communities who weren't necessarily have direct exposure to police violence and direct exposure to police brutality or intensive policing, there's a large decrease in their likelihood of reporting that they trust police and that they think police are doing a good job, et cetera. in a way that I think, again, highlights the potential benefits of social media, of just sort of like diffusing this knowledge around these large disparities in policing across this country, specifically for communities that don't necessarily have direct exposure to those things.
Great, thanks very much. Dwight, you are up next.
Well, I guess we Kennedy School grads all think alike, because that was going to be my question as well on video and its effect on what happens next. One question you answered a bit earlier, but I'd like to hear your more thoughts on, and that is again the racial makeup of the police force vis-a-vis the communities that are being policed, and again, in particularly around the incidents of use of force.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And it's something that's very much at the frontier of the literature, is people asking, if we have more representative police departments, does that lead to changes in how policing is done? At the very extreme margin, does that lead to reductions in police violence, et cetera? And there's research that it really does. And so in Chicago, there's work showing at a very detailed level that Black and white police officers police very differently. And they police very differently, specifically with regards to minority communities, and that Black officers are less likely to make an arrest to resolve a dispute. They're much less likely to use force to resolve a dispute, and they're much less likely to generate a civilian complaint at the end of the day. There's other work looking in the Southwest US where there are circumstances in which it's essentially random whether or not a Black or white or Hispanic officer responds to a certain incident, and they find that in incidents in which the officer responding to an incident, again, the race is essentially randomized, that having a same race officer respond to an incident relative to a different race officer is going to lead to a lower likelihood that force is used, that lethal force or is going to be used, that officers are going to be firing their guns. And so I think that there's increasingly evidence that having a more representative police force could be really valuable for addressing some of these concerns. And again, I think it gets to this idea of thinking about diversity at like a pretty broad level, right? So oftentimes when we think about diversity, we're thinking about diversity in hiring, and it's more about who's getting this one spot, this coveted, job. And it becomes very much this sort of zero-sum game. But if you think of diversity and the impacts of having representation in different professions, having these spillover effects onto actually how those professions are done, what research is conducted, who's stopped, who's not stopped, how much police use of force is done, then it becomes much easier to get a sense of, okay, what are the aggregate effects of diversifying across these different domains.
Great, thank you very much. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand using the Zoom feature. So we had a question that came in from Peter Holmes, MPA 1990. If you could please talk a little bit about police governance, say by independent civilian review boards, and that how that might affect the social impact of policing.
Yeah, I think right now there's not a ton of research on that I'm aware of. I think you can imagine, though, that these things might matter in the sense that a lot of concerns around minority communities with policing and the extent to which communities are willing to call the police, they are willing to comply when police officers ask them to do certain things, et cetera. All of this, a lot of this boils down to trust, right? And that trust is going to be built on a number of different things, some of which is politics, some of which is the extent to which you feel like you have a say in your local government and how policing is done, et cetera. And so you can imagine the role that, the very fact that there is a civilian review board, that we know that this thing was implemented as a way of fostering trust, as a way of fostering oversight, that could have a pretty big impact, even sort of like psychologically or sociologically, on how people view police in a way that potentially could foster improved policing as well as improved trust in policing. But I think the actual research on that, I think, is a little, we're waiting for that, I think, a little more.
Got it. Thanks very much. So Mark Pumper, you are up. Please ask your question.
Hey, thanks so much for the call. Just wanted to check and see, you had a slide talking about the incarceration rates, in the U.S. relative to other, countries. That sort of seems to have overlap with kind of the lack of beds for seriously mental ill. Can you give me a sense of what work is being done, or you may have done, kind of looking at the burden that the seriously mental ill and the lack of, hospital beds has posed on police forces around the country?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And so over a longer time period, there has been sort of the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill. I think that's exactly what you're getting to. I think there's been work done by Steve Raphael, who's an economist at Berkeley, to sort of untangle to what extent are changes in incarceration rates due to sort of deinstitutionalizing mental health, such that these individuals are then just being put into carceral systems. And they find that it matters, but that is far from sort of the leading explanation or the main reason why there have been increases in incarceration rates. And so, maybe this accounts for like 5% of the growth in incarceration rates, but far from that huge growth, the 500% increase in incarceration rates that we saw. Much more of that is around sort of the punitiveness of our criminal justice system, around policies we have in terms of who should be incarcerated and for how long, et cetera, and what constitutes a crime.
Great, thank you. Our next questioner is Leanna Benson. If you could please let us know your affiliation and ask your question.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Leanna Benson. I'm a graduate from the MPP program, class of 2010, and I'm also a 11-year resident of Los Angeles. So thank you very much for your presentation. It really hit close to home. I'm also an African-American woman. My question is, what nations do you recommend that we look to that seem to be doing this well? I mean, in America, we look to what's going on in other states, but in your research, have you found successful models in other countries that maybe we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. I don't have empirical research on this. I think just sort of my sense of my sort of like broader informal sense on this is that I think looking at other countries can be informative, and it can certainly be informative in terms of thinking about whether or not we're an outlier, how our policies correspond to other countries' policies. But the US is very unique in sort of the evolution of our law enforcement system, and we're also just at a very different place with regards to race relations, with regards to how policing is done, that it becomes a little less obvious, like how to take something, for example, that's working in Australia and import it over to how it works in the US, right? And you can imagine in a situation like the United States, where there's a lot of gun carrying, there's a lot of sort of like illegal gun carrying as well. And there's a lot of distrust between police and communities that, for example, like disarming police in a way that has been done in Australia could have very different effects here than it could in those other countries. And so I think a lot of like where we're at is somewhat path dependent and specific to the United States. And I think that makes it a little more complicated to think about how we need to be addressing these issues. And again, that's not to say that those policies, like at the end of the day, I think a lot of people argue that, we just don't want police to have guns, period. But I think that the reality of, given how much discrimination there has been historically, given how much that has led to distrust, et cetera, it gets a little harder to think about how we would actually get there in the longer run.
Thanks for that question and answer. Our next person up is Cynthia Hodges. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Hodges, a graduate of the MPA program in 2002, and very much interested in the topic of the impact of police violence on communities. So I first want to just thank you very much for the work you're doing. You brought forth a lot of information that I was not aware of, that I had not seen before. Can you share with us what motivated you to look at this topic to the extent that you're looking at it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Cynthia. This comes from somewhat of a personal place, not in terms of like what the findings would actually show, but just in terms of my interest in the topic. And so I grew up in a part of Virginia in this country where there just weren't very many people that looked like me. And for whatever reason, my parents decided to settle there. And so I think a lot about this idea that race is going to be a lens through which people view events, through which they interpret events, and that our interactions with different institutions are really going to color how we feel about our own aspirations, how we feel that we can or can't engage with these same institutions and other institutions as well. And so in that lens, thinking about the role of race, the role of like perceptions of discrimination, perceptions of injustice on how we actually conduct our lives in some sense. And police killings are obviously a very important topic in their own, but they're also sort of a very, very sort of salient event in which there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these feelings are very much heightened in the wake of police killings. And so this is in a very narrow sense, this is just a way for us to quantify, what's the impact of police killings and how should we be weighing that against the crime benefits of more aggressive policing or more police in general. But then in a broader sense, I think it gives us a window into thinking about what is it like to be sort of a racial minority growing up in an area where you might have concerns about injustice and discrimination, and how does it affect your long run outcomes in terms of whether you're going to school, how you're engaging with the government, how you're engaging with law enforcement, et cetera. And so that latter bent is very much how I began approaching this topic. But I think, again, I think both of these aspects are very much central to what we actually find.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that question and answer. So our next question came in from the chat from Jeff Ashford, who is MPP 1982. And he was wondering, given recent efforts at policing reform legislation, such as the George Floyd Act, which was passed by the House but is languishing in the Senate, and resistance to higher standards for accountability and accreditation by police associations and unions, is research looking at the cultural barriers to improving police community relations and the use of force? What is the role of lobbying and public relations efforts by police unions and other organizations?
Well, that's a great question. It's a lot to unpack. I think the history of policing, the current moment that we're in, there's a lot of politics involved, and there's a lot of very different and very entrenched stakeholders. All of which I think tie in with what you're asking. I think some of this is very hard to tease apart from the type of research that I do and other economists do, which is a bit more narrow in terms of being able to isolate a specific impact of a specific thing. And culture is something where there's not sort of specific shocks to culture that allow us to sort of like isolate how do these changes in culture impact other outcomes. And so unfortunately, I don't have a ton to say on that, but I do think in some broader sense, these things are vital to how we think about policing, how we think about policing reform, and the sort of blowback that we have seen in terms of calls for reform in the recent past.
Great. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question live, please use the Zoom hand raising feature. We have another question that came in from Gary Grimm. And that is, the selection of officers and their training depends on what we define as their role. Have you or anyone else looked at the impact of the selection and training of officers on the social impact of policing?
That is an excellent question, Gary. And I think you're exactly right. And there's a huge sort of a set of articles in the New York Times recently talking about police violence and how a lot of police killings, and I saw this in my own research, emerge from stops of motor vehiclists who had no weapon, but police are sort of trained to approach that situation as if it was very fraught, leading to decisions in which the driver of the vehicle was killed or the passenger was killed, etc. And so I do think training and selection has a huge role to play in all of this. There is some work coming out from UC Irvine by Emily Owens, who's a very prominent economist who studies crime, showing that having sort of training of police officers so that they sort of take a moment to think about situations as opposed to sort of immediately escalating them can sort of reduce use of force. I think this is happening. I don't think we should expect that to sort of solve what we find, but it could reduce what we see in terms of use of force rates and certainly sort of unwarranted use of force at the margins. And so there's certainly more work thinking about doing that as well. There's other work in other contexts thinking about, for example, racial discrimination among bail judges and other types of actors within the criminal justice system. And I think there's some work there that actually shows that more experienced individuals are less likely to rely on racial discrimination and stereotypes to make decisions in such a way that perhaps more training or selection of more experienced individuals might help to mitigate some of these biases as well. But again, I think these things are happening at a relatively small margin, and we shouldn't expect that these things are going to drive the number of police killings in this country down to 0. They'll just take it down from 1,000 into something a little bit lower, I think.
Great, thank you very much. We have a question that came in from Wendy B., who is MPP class of 2012. It's a two-part question. So are there efforts underway to do similar research in other cities? And secondly, what other outcome areas are you exploring under the umbrella of social impacts, apart from student outcomes and voter turnout?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, I mean, I would love to do similar research in other cities. The main constraint is really getting detailed enough data to be able to identify the effects. So what we saw in the LA setting was that these events really only impact students that live relatively close to them, right? And so that requires having data at a very disaggregated level where you know where the students live exactly, where police killings occur exactly, and so you can sort of map these things out. If we were to sort of zoom out and say what's the average effect on graduation rates across all of LA, it's somewhat doubtful that we'd be able to find or even identify some of these effects. And so I think the constraint there is really just data constraints. And so if you have any leads on that, I'm obviously open to more than open to hearing them. In terms of thinking about other outcomes, I think all of the work that I do touches on this idea that's a little more core, right? Like we're looking at proxies of engagement with schools, engagement with electoral systems, engagement with criminal justice systems. All of that, you can imagine, has some motivating underlying driver, which is something to do with trust in institutions, thinking about like, how do I resolve disputes? Who do I go to resolve these things? Like ultimately, what are my feelings around law enforcement system? How does that affect who I trust within my community? Whether or not I take part in community organizations, gangs, etc., in a way that is really core, if you think about sort of development of different communities in the United States. There's something really sort of foundational there that's hard to capture in some of these outcomes, even though they're economically important. And so I think one thing that I'd love to be able to do is to really hone in on some of these sort of psychological, sociological mechanisms that are happening. Like ask people, like what's actually happening in the wake of these police killings? How does it affect you? Who you trust, who you care about, how you feel about people of other races, how you feel about people of the same race, how you feel about different institutions, etc., in a way that really gets to sort of like the belief motivations behind these things. And so I think that's obviously a difficult thing to capture, but I'm hoping that there's some of using some type of survey evidence to get to it.
Great, thank you very much. Our next questioner is Paula McKinney-Rainey. Go ahead and state your affiliation and ask your question. Okay, her hand raise was unintentional. So we have another question that came in from Patrick Caceres, MPP 2004, and he is also an independent police investigator for BART. So if you could define the term police killings.
Yeah, so police killings are incidents in which police killed somebody. And so that's obviously not to say anything about sort of like legal justifiability. And in most cases, almost all of these circumstances, they are legally justified. So what we're looking at here is where somebody died at the hands of police. And in most of these circumstances, what we're looking at are someone was killed because the police shot them. But there's other ways in which police can kill individuals. And again, that's very different from legal definitions of whether or not they were, criminally at fault.
Understood. Thank you for clarifying that. So our next question is from somebody with the initial A. You could let us know your name and your question. Hello, you are on. Okay, let's go to the next question. Not sure what's going on there. Just wondering if you could talk about police service, whether it should be limited to combat criminal behavior specifically, and should new services be adopted using people who've been educated and trained, for example, to handle such things as traffic violations?
So, sorry, so the question is around.
Yeah, the question is like, the extent of using police just for criminal activity as opposed to like traffic violations or more minor misdemeanors. Is that a trend that you've researched at all or seen any impact of?
Yeah, so I think there's some research on that. I'm not super familiar with it. I think that there is certainly research around and thinking around the idea of like, do we need police officers making traffic stops if it puts them and the driver in sort of harmful situations, when we could be doing something similar with technology, using radar guns and automatic ticketing, etc. I think that's sort of the frontier of the research in terms of thinking about how that reduces use of force, how that perhaps improves trust in government, etc. I think to your point, there's a lot of research suggesting that not just police violence, but like very aggressive, proactive forms of policing, like stop and frisk, etc., have just like detrimental on net impacts in communities. And so I think you're exactly right in thinking like, well, what are the ways that we can be achieving these same goals without necessarily involving these face-to-face police contacts?
Great, thank you very much for answering that question. Just see if there's anything else in the chat. So just wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of not only the training of police officers, but the kind of characteristics of police officers who are, maybe getting their, and this question came in earlier, getting their facts from maybe questionable media sources, and basically, just the whole division between, fake news and all of that. Like, are there any efforts being made to educate police officers?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And it's something that, everyone is susceptible to, right? Like there's a lot of evidence, including some of my research, that media can have these very important role to play in terms of how people view people of other races, actually how their behavior towards people of other races, like racial violence, racial prejudice, etc. And that this is something that we're all susceptible to, whether or not we're sort of selecting into like listening to very extreme radio or watching very extreme TV, but like that there are these subliminal effects too of just like watching things that perpetuate certain stereotypes in media, etc. And so, I don't, obviously police are an important margin in this regard, but, I think we're all sort of like vulnerable to these impacts. And I think there is sort of more work thinking about, okay, when does media matter? When does it not matter? Like what are ways that we should be thinking about regulating these things? But I'm not super aware of something like this specifically in the context of law enforcement.
Got it, thanks. We have time for one more question. We're going to go to Bob Ferry. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Professor. This is really valuable. I appreciate it. You make the point that more cops equal less crime, but at what and whose cost? Is there any research out there that would project maybe, do more guns mean more crime? If we had actual gun control, European style, Japanese style gun control, is there any data out there or research out there?
Yeah, let's see. There is research. I think the research is somewhat mixed in terms of, I think what they look at are sort of gun control policies in different states. And, when you put in these policies, does that affect crime? The research is actually surprisingly mixed in that regard. I think that is a little bit of a different question than what you're getting at, which is like, is there some state of the world in which like there's just no more guns, right? Or there's a lot more guns? Like, what does that do? You can imagine that we are in this equilibrium now where there's already a lot of guns, and so there's already a lot of stuff that's circulating, and we don't already have a good sense of how many guns are even circulating. There's not very good data on that, and so it becomes a little harder to think about, this state of the world in which we're having like these drastic changes in gun policy, if that makes sense, to project what would happen there.
Sure.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who called in to listen to this last Wiener Conference call of the calendar year. And a special thank you to Desmond Ang for providing his expertise this morning to our Kennedy School alumni and friends. Have a great holiday season and see you in the new year.
Thank you so much, everyone.